rather than the so you don't buy any coffee because that has that.
Ready, sir? All right. Well, how about we get going here? Everybody got a brownie?
It was turned down.
Coffee? Whatever you might need. We're sort of full service. It's kind of like go get your own snack. But, all right. So today we're going to have a bit of a reading from David Axelrod. MJ, the next one is, I forgot. Nancy Knowles on the 9th of February. Does that sound right, Nancy? She says yes. So thanks for coming today. We really do appreciate it. And please come back for Nancy next time, 2 weeks from now. Is that right? That's the 9th? All right, Nancy, what are you talking about? Eastern Promise and stuff. So come on back. But for today, we have David Axelrod. David Axelrod has taught at EOU since 1988. Check that for typos. It is 1988 David has been here. So he's currently the co-director of EOU's Low Residency Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing program. He's authored 7 collections of poems and a collection of creative nonfiction titled Troubled Intimacies. He won the Spokane Poetry Prize for the Cartographer's Melancholy and was a finalist for the 2006 Oregon Book Award. David edits with his spouse and colleague Jody Varon Basalt, a journal of fine arts, fine and literary arts. His editorial works also include Sensational Nightingales, a collection of collected poetry of Walter Pavlich. Pavlich? Close. I'll take close. Forthcoming from Lynx House Press. His new collection of poems, The Open Hand, is forthcoming from Lost Horse Press. David's other work has appeared recently or is forthcoming in About Place, American Poetry Journal, Cape Rock, Cascadia Review, Cloud Bank, Crazy Horse, Fogged Clarity, The Hopper, Hubbub, Miramar, Southern Poetry Review, and Stringtown, among others. Today, David will be talking about Tracking the Northern Sorrow Monkey, notes from a year-long expedition. And with that, folks, please welcome David Axelrod.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out. I didn't know whether anyone would come or not, and thank you genuinely for being here for this hour today. I have enough material to talk about for several hours, but that won't happen. I can skip a few things. The pretext for this talk is, of course, primarily to report on my sabbatical last year, the things I did and wrote. But also, the particular focus was generated a few weeks ago, skiing down Mount Emily on a late afternoon with a friend and a colleague who had said, "Oh, by the way, you weren't lying about what you told me." And I was like, well, now what could that possibly be that I was lying about? Just trees really do communicate with each other, and dying trees send their nutrients to nearby trees, their own offspring, through the networks of fungi. And I said, why did you think I was lying? Why would I lie about something like that? And she said, well, you know, you're a poet. And I just like, God, I've just heard that all my life. And I mean, I've been writing poetry since, for 50 years, you know, and I just thought, you know, what nonsense. And so I acted a little peeved. And she says, well, you know, poetic license. And poetic license is an interesting term. I mean, the common definition of it is the freedom to depart from the facts for an effect. And certainly that's how people use it. But I mean, strictly as a literary term, it means only that you would, if you were writing verse, for example, metrical verse, you might use a grammatical inversion or add a diacritic to change the emphasis on a particular syllable so as to preserve the meter. And so, I mean, it just seems like a very strange thing to hang your hat on, to criticize people for poetic license. And so it got me thinking about the way everyone runs away from poetry as though it is the most horrible and terrifying matter at hand ever. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions that I wanted to talk about today. And I'm going to do something that I'm usually loath to do, and that is I want to share some of the work I've done this year, but I want to talk about it in terms of its source material and the quality of attention that one pays to one's source material, and how that source material is based in reality. Truly, I mean, for lack of a better word, and how even in cases that are obviously fantastic, as in fantasy, the fantasy originates in reality. And that this quality of intention has a tremendous respect for the integrity of things as they are, and constellates the material in such a way, yes, to create an effect, but that effect, I think, is also meant to reflect things as they are, or if they reflect things as they are, to also suggest things as they might be. And finally, how different kinds of voices concentrate differently. There are some voices that are very focused and others that are very expansive and associational. And I want to give some examples of that and why one might make different kinds of choices about the way a voice focuses on material. And finally, last but not least, how ideally the poet vanishes. That being concerned about whether David Axelrod is lying again is really kind of missing the point. It doesn't really have anything to do with David Axelrod, ultimately. So first of all, let's talk about the summer of 2015. I spent virtually all my time doing bibliographical research, trying to find all of the published work that a friend of mine named Walter Pavlich had published in the 1970s and 1980s. Walter and I had met in Missoula. He was Jody's upstairs neighbor. He was very loud. And so we got to know him. And Walter wrote and published 3 major collections in his lifetime, and a number of chapbooks as well, and died at the age of 48 suddenly in the early 2000s. On the morning of July 20th, 2013, I woke up from a dream in which Walter Pavlich and his wife, the poet Sandra McPherson, visited me near dawn and discussed the unavailability of his poetry. And was there anything I could do to help? And it was like a really frank conversation we were having. And I woke up and I was like, wow, that seemed real enough to me. And I said, of course. And I contacted Sandra McPherson, who I had never been in touch with before, and told her what my intentions were, what I'd like to do. I thought I had some ideas about potential publishers. Would she help me? But she had recently been institutionalized after a nervous breakdown and I think perhaps a suicide attempt. And so it slowed matters down, but eventually she recovered, and we have carried on a long conversation with each other and worked on this, and we are going to see the book come out. His work will be back in print for the first time in almost 20 years. So it was a nice way to begin my sabbatical. I'm going to just read you a couple of poems from that, a couple of late poems from his life. Walter and I had a lot in common. He grew up working class, an immigrant family. His early work was very much animated by a kind of class rage and hard living and so on. The hard living finally did him in. But he was also very much concerned with social injustices of the ghettos, the economic dislocations of the ghetto he was raised in. And he, like myself, was drawn to Richard Hugo's orbit in Montana in the early 1980s, where we both studied with him. And he, like myself, fell in love with the wild places of the Pacific Northwest. And we shared a love of African American music, especially blues music and gospel music. And I want to just focus really on his interest in gospel at the end of his life. He had been a terrible alcoholic and drug addict. And I don't know which came first, AA or the Sensational Nightingales, who were an African American gospel band. But he fell in love with gospel music. He was a pretty secular fellow, generally speaking. But it was the welcome he found in African American churches that straightened him out and kept him sober the last, I think, maybe 8 years of his life before he died. So I thought I'd just give you an example of a poem of his. There's really nothing fancy about it. He's just talking about listening to gospel music with other people and their reaction, his reaction. All the details in here, they're probably all real, right? This is just reportage. It's called Wings to the Resting Place. The singer asks for wings, wings to fly to the resting place. And the congregation prays for many pairs of wings. Right now, the shoulders are too weak. The wings would be a burden. One could not turn side to side to see if others were watching. At the proper time, when one is rising, one looks down to say goodbye, and then up, through and past the sun. Those who've gone on don't need the faithful's prayers. The prayers here are for those afflicted, those who are dizzy with high blood pressure, feet that won't walk, finance charges on a rental bed. Each head so heavy. It is time to rise up again out of the rows of borrowed chairs. It is time to sing again, to pray with notes, sorrow harmonizing with joy, asking for wings, beautiful wings, to the resting place. And, you know, I mean, I imagine it's a song, it's a popular song, Wings to the Resting Place. And it brought him a great deal of peace late in his life. I'll give you one more of those. This is called the closest thing to church other than church. And again, it's just reportage from Oakland, you know, going to going to church from Oakland to Sacramento on a bus, right? And you know, some of you know the route. So the closest thing to church other than church. And listen closely to just that first line that frames all his intentions here. It is this, and only this, that brought me round. The people who ride their buses from grade school cafeterias to churches in Oakland, to a dangerous on the outside yet meant little teen center on the outskirts of Sacramento, where the nearby convenience store sells frozen burritos along with gold chains alongside knives. The bus idles unspiritual diesel in the parking lot, while the singers inside wake up to dress into the finest suits they can afford and pray to help their voices get ready for one more show. This isn't exactly church, but it's a holy performance, and I, the only white person there, am allowed to lay my burden down along with anyone else who attends. For 2 hours or so, we bring up our troubles and have them sung through the tinny sound system, the voices coming from all sides, up and down, so that the listener is always in the center of every song. We nod at our problems as we would acknowledge a friend across the room. And if one wants to shout, then one shouts in the Spirit, because the Spirit has gone inside now with its shivery, ephemeral blush. That person might dance. That person might faint or fall out, as it is called, which makes the singers sing harder, sweeter, sweatier. We are blessed in collective perspiration and go to our cars helped, amended, our souls given a bright, exhaustive workout. The bus makes its way to the highway. Each of us shines for a while inside, like birds that have swallowed the seed of the sun. It was important to him, and it saved his life for a while. It let him live a better life, and he wrote about it. I mean, this strikes me as a profoundly personal poem, but I doesn't appear anywhere in it. It's we, and it's the experience of we, and the disappearance of the poet in the poem that makes it so accessible beyond his experience, so that it is ours as well. And I just remind you, a sort of a grim side note, this is the very same welcome that Dylan Roof would have received in the African American church that he went into and shot up. And so it provides a contrary narrative, I suppose, of ourselves in our own time than the one that we hear about most often. But both of those poems, you'll notice, are very focused on a single event, a single place, a single time, and stay very much just sort of watching this moment. There's another one here. It is a poem, too, of a moment, but it is expansive. It has this wide peripheral vision that pulls everything it can to itself in the short space of its lyrical moment. It's the last poem he wrote. It was left on his desk in hand script in blue ink the morning he didn't wake up. And so this is his last poem, The Spirit of Blue Ink. What this morning do I have as I put out my welcome mat for hope? Enough millet for 6 months to keep my bargain with the finches. I fill, they eat, and then they fly away. A yard of Thoreau on the bookshelf, in case I want a paragraph on sweetgrass, floating heart, or pigweed. Or the dry field guide to the ocean, the sea still in print with punctuation. A gospel record Christ in vinyl from the 50s, 33 1/3 hallelujahs per minute. A school bell across the street teaches the lessons of time, velocity, and hard music. A mere waiting. A morning movie shot during the previous war, smiles and cigarettes, bright songs and cocktails. And if I'm lucky, I can approach the spirit of blue ink, the glory of the hand that works the difficult and the dead, that waits out the past, attached as it is, not to a wrist, but the heart that is the leaf that blows its way to you. And that poem is a little different. I mean, it's focused on a moment in the morning, but he's sort of casting all over to watching a war film from the previous war, I guess it would be the Vietnam War, to the school bell across the street, et cetera, drawing everything to him from the periphery. But it is just a different kind of lyrical attention that he has in that poem and than in the previous ones. And the faith he has that he can draw disparate things together and they will make something whole, something hopeful to keep on living. The irony is, sadly, he didn't live. He woke up dead that day. But that poem, perhaps more than any, cast quite an influence on me in the year that lay ahead. And I simultaneously to working on this manuscript of Walter's work and tracking down what he had never kept track of himself. He wasn't a real tidy guy, and early on in his life, he didn't keep lists of where he'd published things, and that's sort of so on, so forth and so on. But that lyrical peripheral view is something that I was drawn to as a much younger man and abandoned about the time I arrived here in La Grande in the late 1980s. And in the last year, it came back very strongly and has dominated what I've worked on for the rest of the year and into this year. A couple of the poems I'll read here are from a manuscript that I wrote this year. It's not done. None of these are done. They're pretty rough, actually. But it's called The Northern Sorrow Monkey. And for the last 10, 15 years, I've written almost exclusively about Europe and my time in Europe, where I have spent a lot of time. And in the last year, something changed, and I was able to make a transition from the way I learned to see Europe to how I can see the depth of time and habitation here. That this world, which has frustrated me, Eastern Oregon, although I love it, has frustrated me. I suddenly saw in ways that I appreciated more than ever in the last year, and they have worked their way into my writing throughout the year. I'll give you just an example. This is a poem called Just North of the Windy Ridge Fire. You'll all remember the Windy Ridge Fire. It filled our valleys with lots of smoke. Specifically, the poem takes place at Chimney Lake, of all places, a place many of you have been. But it goes like this. And there's nothing fancy here. It's just the stuff present in a moment with my family. And Andy Sheely, for whatever that's worth to James. In the lee of evening, in the apocalyptic glow at dusk, the candled trees rain ashes onto moss below a spring, whose monkey flowers cast a deeper hue of yellow in scattered light. 10 years ago, we sowed the beloved's cremains here, a gray cloud fanning out over white sand, the freshet carrying her into the lake, where she sank into the calmer diffusions of blue. Tonight, when we spark the spirit dish, it flares like a torch and draws to us agile little brown bats who swarm from the caves in boulder fields, who hunt in the smoke that shrouds the lake, their wings blood-veined and soft as a newborn's wrist, brush our faces in the dark. Which is a really creepy thing to have happen, to tell you the truth, to be honest with you. But it makes quite an impression because, you know, it was so smoky, you really couldn't see them. Then suddenly, you know, they brushed by your face because they couldn't quite make you out either. There was so much particulate in the air. The light was so scattered. And I imagine the particulate that scatters light probably also, maybe someone can help me with this who's a physicist, that echolocution gets scattered as well by particulate in the air. It's something I would like to know, but I don't. There's that. I'll give you another example. A similar thing, and the word erotic comes up in here, and my students this term have been really afflicted by my long digressions on eros, and not quite in the sense that you might think, rather in the sense that of the erotic being that which preserves life, cares for life, nourishes life, protects life, not just what arouses sexual passion. That is, I think, in the dictionary, the third definition, the tertiary definition. So that is another aspect of the work, is to try to speak of the erotic as much as possible in my work. Is there anything really? No. So this is actually just this is a poem. The source of this poem, the occasion of this poem, is going out to gather vegetables from our garden on O Avenue. Okay, and we have screech owls in the little woods behind our house, and they make quite a feast of Eurasian doves and Columbia ground squirrels and squirrels, invasive squirrels. But that is really, oh, and I remember very clearly we picked eggplants that night in the garden. So that is really the occasion for this. Summer evenings in the Grand Ronde. Cold air came tumbling down the foothills at dusk when screech owls began to whinny and trill in the elders. Roused, eyes alert, their faces bobbed as they took in the full measure of prey and launched their ponderous surveys of the near dark, that weird, agile flight at almost stall speed. We, too, had tried to prolong the erotic euphorias of garden and household that sheltered us for 30 years. We swerved from the open gaze traversed all day and yielded the vast room, shielding ourselves behind hedges in shadows so as to share our meals in secret, wooden bowls full of August and increase. And small animals, those careless enough to leave burrows and chase after the little candle called hunger. I recall them too, in the last moments of their lives, glancing back in wonder at Capricorn, at Sagittarius, and the full moon wheeling up above the trees, and that yelp of surprise. Stall speed. Snowy owls fly at stall speed, slower than stall speed. Nobody knows why or how, but there's a scientist at I think the University of Montana who studies this and goes north every summer and with his speed, his speed clock, and he always mystified by how can they stay aloft? They're flying at less than stall speed. These at almost less than stall speed. But that is another one of these new poems. Later in the summer, Dr. Varon and I went on a trip to the Bowen Lakes canoe circuit. George Venn had told us about this in about 1822, I think. He had told us about his 17th century adventure there, and with the Mackenzie party, and we had always wanted to go there, and we took our big kayak. It's a 21-foot kayak. It weighs 81 pounds unloaded. Has anyone ever seen the film Fitzcarraldo? Yeah, we called it the Fitzcarraldo, and for much the same reason. We had to go over a lot of uphills and downhills with this huge boat, which Dr. Varon did not appreciate in any single case. But we were there one night. We were camped with a German couple we had met. The man and the couple was electrical engineer who wrote the algorithm for Skype. Yeah, and someone who's had a lot of effect on the world when you think about it. And he was an interesting fellow. He kept track of how many nights he had slept outside. His parents had been school teachers, and as soon as the school year ended in Germany, they would head to Greece and they'd camp on the beach every summer, all summer. And so as a child, he spent a lot of time outside camping. When he was 13, his father took him to Yellowknife and the river that flows north, the Churchill River. They were on maybe the Yellowknife River. I don't know, but they were let off 40 miles from anywhere. And they started down the river, and the first couple days, everything was fine, but then a bear ate their lard. They had a 5-gallon bucket of lard, and basically that was all their calories, and they ended up having to spend the next 36 days or more making their way out without really any fat. And I think he lost, I don't know, he was like 75 pounds when they got out. It was quite an ordeal, but he was hooked. And he has spent his entire life going on these adventures. And only because of the relative inexperience of his wife were they at Bowen Lakes, which seemed like a great experience for us. But that night, in the middle of the night, there was a blood-curdling cry on the beach below us. Dr. Varon says, "What was that?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't really want to know." She says, "Are you going to go out there?" And I said, "Are you kidding? I am not going out there. I don't want to know. I'm pulling the covers over my head. I'm going to do the brave thing." It turns out they were having exactly that same conversation in the other tent. And The next morning, I got up and started the stove and was cooking, and the fellow came out and joined me, and we were talking about it, and he said, "Did you hear that cry last night?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "What do you think it was?" And I looked at him, and I just said, "Oh, it sounded like the Northern Sorrow Monkey to me." And he chuckled, and I chuckled, and I thought, yeah, that's a really good joke, and I got to use that. And that was a particularly long and difficult day. I think we had 4 portages, 2 rivers with deadheads and sweepers, and then like really strong headwinds and 4-foot waves to get to our next campsite. It was a long day of paddling and carrying Fitzcarraldo and our packs, et cetera, et cetera. But I started thinking about it, and by the time we got home, I started working on this poem, and it was almost too easy. It starts out with a field guide description of Simia dolor borealis. Rare across its range, prefers highland forests near open water, matrilineal, not gregarious, forms loose-knit groups only when young are present, otherwise solitary, retreats to isolated refuges in mature trees, browses on mistletoe, club moss, horsetail, lungwort, and blueberries when available. Needles of hemlock and red cedar fronds are important winter forage. Individuals have been observed taking salamanders and tree frogs, Grieve, 1949. Often mistaken for a juvenile yeti. Typically silent, though when mating, its copulatory vocalizations are imitative of and sometimes confused with the melancholy yodels and harsh howls of others with whom it shares its diminishing range. Field Guide to North American Monkeys. And it so happens to be the only entry in the entire book. First time I read this to people, they were like, "Really?" I mean, and they'll say, "But you mean you made that up?" And I said, "Well, yeah, obviously I made it up. You know, you can tell." So, the poem. A howl from the beach below our camp woke us at night, and moments later, another answering from Crummelt's high on the mountain above. Then still night again, the moon path leading away down the glassy lake to falls we planned to portage around days later. Bright moonlit hemlocks and cedars, draped in solemn green robes, stood around us, attentive as we were, who startled awake, at first afraid of those daunted cries. A song we knew, a round first taught in kindergarten, the one that goes, "No, not you, not for you, not now, probably never." The sorrow monkey, living without hope in its dwindling sliver of life, crowded by refugees from that world on fire in the south, aware that nothing else is possible beyond the already known. There will be no more adventuring forth, only hammering back into the familiar hole. No achievement, no infinite theorem or 100th monkey, just limits, the falls, a border never to be dared, and the range of that roar, its cascading over cliffs, the mist rising, rapids churning below. All are a reminder of how the farther a sorrow monkey roves, the louder the overawing rebuke. A trail around hazards is a risk never taken. Those two didn't call out twice, though we sat up waiting, listening all night, recalling those troubled howls, a moonlit dome of fog hovering over the unnavigable falls. We soon found a route around. And I just, by way of comment, about source material and so on, I mean, the descriptions are pretty accurate descriptions of Isaac Lake and the area below Isaac Lake, and on down to Lanese Lake, I guess is the name. And, but obviously it's a fantasy, right? I mean, the conceit is obvious, and so it is a lie. But the more I thought about it and tried to explain it to myself, I realized what I was writing about partly was about the predicament of wildlife in an era of global warming, and how, that whole world up there is on fire, and it is a cool, green, wet world, but not so much anymore. And it's filling up like everywhere else with people trying to get away from the heat in the south. And the pressure on wildlife, of course, is great, and so on and so forth. But the more I thought about it, that certainly is true. That was probably, on some level, intentional. But I realized I'm talking about white men, and the predicament white men find themselves in, and the stubbornness with which, as a culture and as masculinity, we can't change. We just want to turn back the clock and punish women and minorities for any gains they've made. And it's a fool's errand, obviously. But one has to take the risk of getting around those falls. And we're now in an era where the reluctance to find a way around the falls is going to haunt us all, right? And I thought ultimately, on some level, that fantasy is a political parable of our time. So I'm going to I'll just read one. I have to read one thing here that I'm running out of time quickly. But I ended up back in Europe soon, not long after that, and finishing up a book called The Open Hand. And I found myself in Norway, and then in Germany, where I worked on translations. And so I'm just give you a poem from Norway. It's called Julaften, that is Christmas Eve. And the details here are, again, drawn directly from experience. And even though it stays focused on the poet longer than I feel comfortable, by the end, of course, it shifts away, and the poet disappears. Julaften. The Arctic night, towering like a wall in the starlit north. There I was, stranded at a trailhead, forsaken, pacing back and forth, trying my best to stay warm, checking my watch, dumbfounded by Screamier's trickery. Sure, the bus would soon return. The new moon slid off the edge of the earth. Dusk began to deepen. The cold, as they say here, started to sour. From snow-blasted pines, a man glided slowly as in a dream down the trail toward me and asked, "Why in the world are you waiting out here in the cold? This night, of all nights, shouldn't you be inside with the ones who love you?" I might have asked him the same, though of course he knew why, and offered a ride to town, bound, he said, by a pledge to do as a man did for him long ago in a blizzard in the Alps. Right then, I was so cold, I could have cried in the dark for the gift that keeps changing hands, making its private avowals. Tucked in high under eaves now, among the ones who love me, someone stands out there, still in the cold, full of eye shine and turmoil. May the one who waits for rescue hear a stranger singing the oldest song the world knows, its melody decoded from cuneiform, a human voice so full of welcome. Hearing it, we shed landslides of grief. There's a bed for you at the inn, the song goes, though nothing warrants when or even if anyone will place the gift into your open hand. He's a nice guy. He was a nice guy. He was Dutch. He was a software developer for Microsoft, and the oldest melody in the world has actually been discovered. It's decoded from cuneiform. It's a Sumerian song, and actually a whole group of Sumerian songs that have been scored as they were played, and instruments designed and constructed as they would have been played, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. That's nice. Well, we're almost out of time, and I think what I'll do is I'm going to skip over the translations of My Wonder because it takes forever, and she deserves to be spoken of at some length, Elsa Lasker-Schuler. But while we were in Germany, we went to Berlin, and our grandson was born. And I think I'll just end with a poem about that moment of his birth halfway across the world. It's called The Ghosts of Berlin. And it's a song by a woman named Andrea Schrader. Is that her name, Schroeder? I can't remember her name. It's a beautiful song. You can find it on YouTube with a video. But it goes like this. That morning a year ago, before dawn, before we heard you were born, we already were walking toward you in silence through the Tear Garden and falling snow. 2 foxes dashed across the Reichstag lawn and vanished under the trees. Ghosts, we said, of all that was wild in a world parallel to ours and rarely stumbled upon. It's always closer than we think, this wonder, not a singular event, but many gifts of other souls fusing themselves to earth. It's enough sometimes to cause a tremor to ripple through us, the wavering light on a wall, tall grass, aspen leaves twirling in a light breeze, the sound water makes spilling over cobbles. Our lives too, nested, not lost in that monochromatic snow, but making our way full of hope to a hushed room in yet another city, the Enlightenment erected and war burned to the ground. We hurried up the street to your stoop, and your mother, hearing our knock at the door, came to us and lifted you into our arms, you whose name means the loyal one, who leads the wanderers from wilderness to the law. And we knew, gazing into your eyes, we were not so much holding you in our arms then, as you were holding us in the gravity of life on earth. And I'll stop there. So thank you very much for your patience.
Questions, anyone? David says no.
It's okay. Not a problem.
Well, we got one.
I'm just curious, when you're out in the world, in nature, probably worried about how much your baggage weighs. How do you keep track of ideas for writing? Do you carry with you something to write on, or do you just live the experience and come back and reflect on it later?
No, I make notes all the time. For example, the other day, I was I looked at something closely, a piece of obsidian, and I realized that obsidian, which is the blackest of black, glows with a really bright blue color on all its facets. And I thought, oh, there's a lot of meaning in that. And so I just wrote a little book, obsidian facets glow blue, which isn't very good, but it's enough to evoke, the moment, and then, you can remember, the whole moment of everything that was present, the moment of that you saw that blue light emanating out of blackness. That helps, it helps bring all that back to life. So that's how that works, sure. And every day. And Jody often will read me poems, out there, and they have an enormous impact on me. That is an absolute fact. Yeah.
Just to follow on to what Nancy asked, I guess I'm curious now. You talked about the one dream that was very important to you. Do you track other dreams? Are they a source of influence?
Yeah, sure they are. If I'm clever enough to remember them, and that's I don't know that it's so easy always. There was a time about say 1999 when I had already been here 11 years, and we were preparing to go abroad for the first time. This is something I'd waited all my life for, and virtually every night, I had the most vivid dreams that traveled all over the world to places I was going. I mean, I was there. And in fact, I was there, because then when I went there, I was like, oh yeah, it was like this in my dream. But I woke from every one of those and remembered it in its entirety. I filled notebooks that spring waiting for that to go there. And those pieces have become bits and pieces of other things. Some of them were abandoned, some have become their own. But yeah, I paying attention to what goes on in a dream, because dreams work the way lyric poems work. They work by association. It's not always, our rational minds are not always very able to understand the motion of a dream, but lyric poems move peripherally from one image to another, often the way a dream does. And so it's sort of nice nighttime practice, as it were. And you think about it. It's just sometimes you're not aware you're doing it, which is unfortunate. Yes?
So you talked about frustrations and love of Eastern Oregon. Obviously, there's something calling you in Europe also. Can you compare and contrast how Europe fills your spirit?
Yeah, I have an essay about this, actually. And in that essay, I talk about, visiting places where there's been a great deal of history transpire. And even if you don't know it, you sense the presence, depth of human habitation, human events, good and bad. But it's everywhere, and it just radiates out of everything. And I find being in Europe really inspirational. I could write a poem a day in Europe. I mean, just, in fact, the poems about Norway, there's this one bus stop, the bus stop I'm stranded at. Man, so many things happen at that bus stop. I meet someone there every single time. Some weird thing happens. I meet two old women who are saying goodbye for the last time, and one of them has a flock of waxwings following them, and then they wait, and then they follow her back up the hill to Tronsmira. And I'm just like, damn, it's just like it's like a fairy tale. You know, this is so weird. And then, you know, I come home and not have that same sense that and it's an American phenomenon in a way, that I don't imagine Native Americans suffer from this, an inability to see below the surface of things. And so I slowly have kind of trained myself to sense the depth of time here, the depth of human presence, and the depth of non-human presences here. And it's been it's been a great source of inspiration. Plus, there's all the scientific research that goes on here, and people doing interesting things. And that is another layer that helps one see what isn't necessarily immediately evident. And so that's how Europe has helped me learn to see better what is here, and you know, what is present here, even if it isn't necessarily self-evident. I'll give you an example. I'd forgotten that a group of Cayuse Indians were coming by the house to drop off a manuscript. And a big truck pulls out, and I'm out working in the garden, and I'm wondering, what are all those young women doing here? They're certainly not here to see me. So I go back to work. And of course, they're going next door to visit the girls. And I said, no, they're not. Those are Cayuse women. And look at their faces. And I go, oh, fuck, right. I'm supposed to get something from them. And as soon as I make eye contact, out the door they come, and we exchange the manuscript, and off they go. And I was just left with the fear in their eyes. And it's, of course, because there are massacre sites of their people all over our valley and all over the hills. They don't like coming here, except to come to the university, which is a safe space, right? And that realization sort of just, you see down below the surface of things and how others feel about this and this place, its history, unacknowledged history. So, yeah. Dude, we're done.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, folks, for coming. February 9th, Nancy will be here. See you then.